Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk, sponsored by the City of Durham Trust and also by the World Heritage Site. It's obvious from the title that it concerns the World Heritage Site, specifically the Cathedral. And so we wanted to promote this occasion jointly, particularly because of the obvious implications for the setting study about the World Heritage Site. And we'll say more about that after the talk. First, just a few household details, or housekeeping details, I think they should be. We're not expecting any fire emergencies or other emergencies. So if the alarm goes off, we need to vacate the room. We can go out through the doors in which you came in, and also at the back if that's the problem. There are toilet facilities in the foyer area where you came in. And if you could please switch off any mobile phones, or at least turn them to silent, that would be helpful. And it's a great pleasure to have Martin Roberts back with us today after his illness, to see him looking so well as ever. So that's great. And we really look forward to this talk about Durham Cathedral and Eyecatcher in the landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we dim the lights? Or do you have control over that?
Sorry?
Do we do the lights? Sorry, how do we dim the lights?
I think there's something there.
We didn't look at that.
Oh, it's Max. We don't want yeah, possible.
Well done.
Something else.
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you. Good afternoon. This, I know there's a sort of a discussion afterwards about the current position of the cathedral and its setting and so on. Hopefully this will be a useful lead into that. This is purely a chronological narrative, I suppose, trying to see how the cathedral, and we're not going to talk too much about the cathedral development or the dates of it and so on and so forth, more about how it is seen from the outside. So in a sense, we start close into the cathedral, how it's seen from within the town, from within the bowl, and then go further and further afield and chronologically come more up to date, returning, as it were, at the end, because the last way in which the cathedral was used as an eye catcher was with the colleges after the war, St Mary's and so on South Road. I was just saying this is my favourite illustration of Durham. I always think of Roger Norris, bless him, because Roger showed me this in Palace Green Library, God knows how many decades ago, and I think then Palace Green Library had a kind of a reverse version of this, a negative, but even then it stood out as being fantastically interesting, and it is box landscape, which I think we could possibly say is somewhere of 1662 if one wanted to be really risky. It's certainly sort of cousin time. There's no it looks as if the motte has not been stepped and terraced, which we know it was in 1662, 1663, because John Cousin's day books tell us that. So on that alone, and the fact that black stairs, I knew this would fade. There, black stairs cupola, which subsequently collapsed, might date it to that. It's also summer because the trees are in full leaf and so on. And I think it was commissioned by John Cousin as well, because it's significant. The emblazoned prospect of Durham is not over the cathedral, it's over his house, the castle. It smacks of a sketch to show what he was doing in Durham, but it's very accurate. That's the beauty of it. Bar one slight problem, which I'll mention now, and it's the biggest mistake of all. When he started, of course, you'd get the cathedral in first, and when we go to Winnie Hill and look at it at the end, you can actually, well, I don't even need to point it, do it, it's packed in. Basically, there are two western towers, as you know, and you can see both of them from Winnie Hill. But he started and he drew a too fat a central tower. That aside, and it's a massive, that aside, I grant you, everything else is pretty accurate. You can't trust Buck's version of this because he does exactly the same thing from Winnie Hill, but he keeps on moving around and he goes down as well and tries to include the riverbanks, which you cannot see from Winnie Hill. This is faithful. So if you look at St Oswald's Tower on the left there, the range of buildings immediately behind it is the south side of the college, the outer courts of the monastery. And you can do that in lots of places. And if you want to read an analysis of this, I did it in the County Local History Society journal many years ago, because it's just, it's so good. You can even see Dennis and Joe Jones's house at the front here. It's the, there we go. See that? See the one behind this one? That's the garage at the front, and that's the house behind. So everything was recorded. Hallgarth House there, and of course Hallgarth Barns. Fascinating. Anyway, we're not here to discuss that in detail. Let's first of all look at the setting, which, and again, 99% of you will know this anyway, but it's we need to just understand the topography of the cathedral and its landscape. That's the chocolate box image. Notable, and we'll come back to this because of the counterpoint between the castle, between the cathedral and the fulling mill. This is sort of, you know, rich man in his castle, poor man at his feet, and so on at his gate. This counterpoint comes into play in the 18th century, where one's wanting to make contrast between high and low status buildings. And in some cases, if there isn't a low status building, you have to build one. Here we've got it as a gift, but the way the riverbanks have developed in recent years, we're beginning to lose that, I think. Thank you, Jean Woodward, wherever Jean is, but thank you again for this photograph that she sent me a while ago. This makes the obvious point, which we all know about, that when should you go out from the city centre and that incredibly dominant view where everything is on the skyline, you go out and you've got a bowl. You've effectively got two bowls, I suppose you could say. The immediate bowl around the peninsula, the bowl as defined by the excellent publication that David Miller did, and I can't remember whether it's Durham Parish or City of Durham Trust that did it, but anyway, so was it both? Both good. Anyway, so it's brought together that circular walk you can take, and that's the outer bowl, the inner bowl. Go out even further, and Brandon Hill and the Mag Limestone escarpment on the east, and this is taken from behind Coxo. And of course, it was at the time, and it, admittedly, as Jean would say, with a telephoto lens, but at that time when the belfry was screened off for repairs and so on. So you can see how low it sits in the landscape. It's not an Ely, it's not a Lincoln, which you can see from miles away on the skyline. And I suppose first we must consider, before we look at sort of the more considered artistic aspects of it in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, when it was seen part of a romantic and picturesque landscape as a pilgrim beacon. This, I suppose, is a mix of images. The top left is, this is as conceived by a Welsh professor whose name I've forgotten. I know he's no longer with us. Can you remember, Eric? He did consult us about it. I was more worried about the cherries on the top of the roofs and anything else. I think it's vaguely accurate, and he's the only one to attempt to do this very tricky thing, which Ian Curry said you can't do, which is to do the gables along the nave aisles. Ian Curry says in his book he never quite works out how it actually looked, but it shows at least a building relatively low, around about 1133. They paused at this point, didn't go shooting up with the rest of the western towers and the spires, kept probably a fairly lowish central tower, reasonable to assume that. They went off and basically caught upon the claustral buildings, new chapter house, new dormitory in the West Range, and then returned towards the end of the 12th century to go up higher with the western towers. And that's a similar sort of situation by, is it Tony Ball? I'm trying to remember. Terry Ball. I was brought up on Alan Sorrell. Weren't we all? And of course, there was never any sunshine in history. I mean, I just remember Paul Sods on the Roman wall. Everything was dark. He loved doing fantastically darks. And then Terry has sunshine, which is really exciting. But again, a low central tower. We can assume no major tower. Come the 13th century, and there were certainly spires. There are, how many illustrations of the spires? Very few. I know Ian Doyle once showed me one in Palace Green Library, which was painted years after, but so it was a reflection, a remembrance of the spires. Removed in 1657, interestingly enough, by Christopher, and I can't remember his second name, the builder in Crossgate, because Cousin, when he comes into post in 1660, and obviously the spires have gone by then, he asks in one of his visitation sort of reports to the dean, what happened to the lead from the spires? And it's interesting that we don't get an answer, but he never employs this man again. And he employs most people in there. I think he suspects that Christopher, what's his name, of Crossgate, basically took the lead and didn't kind of credit it back to the dean of chapter. Interestingly, he never appears, but they disappeared anyway. And they were kind of brooch spires, so they're quite thin, they're quite needle spires. They're not big, broad ones that would have been seen necessarily strongly in the landscape, I think, for our purposes. I think, by the way, I mean, is this Daniel King? I can't remember who did this. It is. I mean, who, in another respect, you can't trust as far as you can throw him sometimes compared to some topographical artists. So when you look at some of the detail of the lower part of the West Front, you think, well, can we trust him on the spires even? But anyway, we have so few images of the spires, we have to rely on him a little bit. And then, of course, we come to the central tower, and that is the principal eye catcher in the landscape for the purposes of this talk. It had a troubled history. It was very tall, of course, but the one that was hit by, ultimately rather, it was very tall. The one that was hit by lightning in 1429, we don't know. I think there was some talk in the 13th century of the central tower being raised. If I'm wrong, Eric will correct me. Anyway, that was hit by lightning. It was repaired. It was hit again more seriously in 1459. And to the extent that the collapse and the damage to the transepts and everything else must have been so bad that they decided a new tower was needed. That didn't start for 6 years. Now that's a question perhaps of accumulating funds, because although I think technically speaking it's the responsibility of the sacrist to rebuild the tower, I mean most of his job is just buying wine and wafers, and suddenly you have to rebuild the central tower. You obviously fall back on greater donors like the bishop and maybe a landed gentry like the Nevilles and so on to fund all that. Interesting thing is there was a general consensus until a few years ago that the central tower in its two stages, and then the second stage is thought to be an afterthought almost, because you can almost see, and we could see, couldn't we, when the belfry was screened off, that it looked pretty complete in its lower stage. That all that finished in the 1480s, 1490s, and then this is the beauty of learning about a building like the cathedral, that we now know it. In fact, the building went right on for another 20, 30 years into the late years of the 1510s. We know that from dendrochronology, which was done when the belfry was being repaired, 2016, I think. And it's good, it's great that we have new research on the cathedral, because I remember I was doing PEVs and somebody said, well, it's pretty easy to do PEVs. You just put the new buildings in, that's all you need to do. I mean, we know everything about the cathedral, don't we? We don't need to write anything new. And this is a man who didn't know anything about architectural history or whatever, but I mean, he didn't realize that there's constantly re-examining and new information and new science, like dendrochronology is doing great things to increase our knowledge of the cathedral. So here it is on the right in 2016, when it was shrouded, of course, neatly shrouded, so the pinnacle still, you didn't need to use Photoshop here. Go on a dull day and you can just squint your eyes and you can just see that central tower at the point sometime in the 1470s, 1480s, when they reached that stage and decided to go a stage higher. It's thought, I think, that masons from York may have been involved in the construction of the central tower. Just for comparison, this is York on the left, which even then, even if one stopped at that first stage, is taller than York by comparison. But there are similarities in some of the work and the tracery and so on, and the niches and the buttresses going up that suggest there may be some influence from York Minster. But as I say, certainly roof timbers in the belfry at the very high stage, dating from the late 1510s, which means it's a huge, I mean, it's taking about 60 odd years, and considering that, you know, the cathedral was, the entire cathedral in the Norman period was built in 40 years. It's taking 60 odd years to do this central tower. It's messy. I mean, at least with the cathedral, you're starting on a plain cleared site, and you're starting with new foundations and so on. So imagining a central tower dropping or whatever it did, the confusion, the difficulty of rearranging or working around an active monastery was quite hairy, one would have said. Traditionally, people coming, pilgrims coming from the southeast would see this. Conveniently, I've put Jean's input on the right to hide a car that's coming up the hill here. This is Silent Bank, said to be a corruption of Signing Bank. Even then, of course, it's clearly still well down in the landscape. And we know that when you get down the riverbanks, of course, it's supremely dominant. But that's its view with the sun coming from the east. This is an awful photograph. Do you know I can get online of Mountjoy? And of course, this is part of that ring of inner bowl, the inner rim of the bowl, where the body of the cathedral is now pretty much sunk below the horizon, and we're relying entirely on the western towers. And of course, it would have been spires and the pinnacles of the 9 altars and the central tower to provide the beacon, as it were, to guide you. I was saying, just when I was in Durham towards the end of my career, before I went to English Heritage, we did negotiate when the university were developing Upper Mountjoy and all that research establishment around the back of psychology and so on, that there would be a dedicated footpath. They agreed to, we said it would be really nice to have a public footpath to the top of Mountjoy so you could enjoy this view. And they said they would put one in, and it was built into the planning application and the approval. Whether it ever got built, I have no idea, but I couldn't find one, I couldn't go there. But that's the view you get. It's not dissimilar from Winnie Hill, which we'll come to at the end as another fine vantage point. Of course, I mean, in some ways, I was going to leap straight into the whole issue of the riverbanks and how the cathedral looks and how it is viewed from certain critical positions around the city into the 18th century. And that's all to do with the English landscape garden tradition and breaking away from seeing landscape as a contained, formal, enclosed space. But there is this kind of transitional period, and I could have given it a terribly grand transitional period, but there are things happening in the 17th century where people are beginning to see the cathedral beyond, in the same way as it is fully appreciated in the 18th century. The going way back in terms of gardens, there is a tradition, a medieval tradition was hortus conclusus, whereby basically gardens are simply enclosed walls. They're inward-looking, contemplative spaces with no views out. The Elizabethans gradually thought we want to see outside. They built mounts in the corner of their walled gardens so you could climb a mount and look out and see whatever it might be. So there's an awareness of the landscape beyond the four walls of the enclosed garden. Now, a bit of this is happening in Durham. This is, Marion will know this well. For those of us that go to Old Durham Gardens on a Thursday morning, and this still gives, I always blame my total lack of ambition that I've stuck in Durham for so long on the fact it's a pretty good place. And this still lifts my heart every time you turn down Benthouse Lane, you turn right to go down to Old Durham. That whacks you in the face when the sun's on the 9 altars. It is, because not many people know about this, because they all know about the West Front and they go to South Street, and if they can see it through the trees, it's a great view. This is a stunning view, and the cathedral kind of lifts itself above the trees in a dramatic way. And this was, of course, where the Heath family chose to build their garden lower down, where wall garden is down in the dip. And unusually, most unusually, Old Durham Gardens were built, we think 1630, 1660. We think John Heath IV. The Heath started at Keepier. They moved to Old Durham. John Heath IV, he was at Hatfield for a while. He then, while he was developing Old Durham Gardens, he moved here around about 1660. He built a small manor house, and the Heaths, along with the Burdens and the Bows, are one of those laudable County Durham families who thought more of their gardens than their house. If you think of the Bows Gibbside, for example, fantastic landscape. The house is a bit cobbled together, right, and it's off on the side. He didn't spend thousands and thousands or millions and millions today building a fantastic landscape, building a house and then think of the garden. He did garden first. The Burden, he had he had a plan anyway from James Payne of the house anyway, but he did the landscape first. Ran out. Well, I was going to talk to Richard. Did he run out of money or did he run out of time? Anyway, he put the house second. He wanted to do his temple. He wanted to do his lake. He wanted to do his grotto, his medieval, his gatehouse ruin, and all the rest of it. And the Heaths are the same. They cobbled together a sort of a manor house here, nothing terribly grand, not really illustrated historically, so we don't know, but there's no evidence of a great house here. But and this is the odd thing, it was planted on the axis of Durham Cathedral. And this I find strange, and I wish I had some more contextual examples of this, and I don't. You would think, looking at this view, that this is 110 yards of the terrace at Old Durham, and then the gazebo, which is what the central building is, was bang in the middle. It's not. This is off centre. The centre is actually, how will this work? The centre line is about there. And you are then, and so basically when he opened his door in his manor house, John Heath IV, he was actually on the axis of the cathedral. Now that's not a thing you do, and again, I'll defer to Eric or anybody, Richard. I'm not aware of a medieval manor house that was planted on the axis of a cathedral or a building in that way. It seems like a post-medieval thing to do with a 17th century house, when you might, obsessed with axes and symmetry and all the rest, want to do that. But somebody's delivered, so I'm assuming that the medieval manor house here is somewhere else. And the 17th century, John Heath said, well, I want my house there. And I even suspect, I mean, this garden's grown somewhat organically. I think there might have been a gazebo there, and that these were balancing. And then when it extended this way to the south, I was sure of putting a third one on. They knocked this one down to give symmetry again. I could be wrong, but I mean, there's evidence of something happening at the top end there. So Old Durham is planted on this axis, and so it is saying that beyond the walled garden and beyond the gazebo, the view to the cathedral is critically important, and we want to embrace that. We want to take that eye-catcher from a mile away and bring it into the garden landscape. And so that's a sort of sketch I did, which is now a bit outdated, but that's the front door, and it was not much more than a sort of vernacular cobbled together 17th century building. Richard Annis did a little excavation with some students in the garden of Tony and Barbara Ewing, which is there, and never published, but I mean, they found a bit of window and a fireplace and so on. You can still see a few remnants. That chimney breast is still there, but that is the central line for the axis, and a peculiar one too. The other thing that's there, of course, is the barn, which is still there and converted and so on. Okay, and that's as near as you get. A little bit lower, I just think it's a joyous view. The practical problem we've got at Old Durham, I mentioned too, is that we're losing that view because the riverside trees are now rising above the cathedral, so you cannot, from the gazebo, in the summer, see the cathedral. And we're having an interesting debate with the county about shouldn't the heritage of a nationally registered garden, whose only existence in this position is due to the fact that there was a cathedral view, take preeminence over chopping some trees down or coppicing trees that have been previously coppiced. These are about a dozen trees in the view. To the right, there's 20,000 trees in Peeler Woods, plenty of trees there. We'd just like to coppice these again, or provisionally coppice them over the next 10 or 15 years so that we can get a view back. Because the artist Samuel Hieronymus Grimm drew this view in the 1780s, and it's completely bare. I mean, you can literally see the bare rump of Maiden Castle and Mountjoy beyond, not a tree on it. And so the cathedral is quite dominant in that. There's nothing to block your way. But these riverside trees. I was going to say, well, you would until a few years ago. They're just sycamores, because you talk to landscape architects and so Colin will correct me here, but I mean, they've always got a bit of a down on sycamores, haven't they? It's not even native. Well, it was introduced in medieval times, sure that's good enough. No, until of course one particular tree on Hadrian's Wall gets chopped down, and then we all love sycamores again. This is an interesting, this is a stunning, I mean, I could talk all afternoon about this, but it hasn't been properly researched, but just go and look at this online. I don't know if you want a decent copy, I can give it you, because I've got one from the Manchester Art Gallery. I would like to claim I was researching Bransford Castle and took months and months and months to find this. No, go onto Google, go onto images of Bransford Castle, scroll down, and third page down, you get this, which I was pleased to say Alison Hobbs, Margaret's daughter, didn't know existed either, so I felt I was in good company. So I wrote to Manchester Art Gallery and got a decent image. It is a fantastic illustration, taken probably if you go down the Page Bank Road, go beyond Bransford and turn left. If you're going down to Spennymoor, there's higher ground on the right-hand side as you descend towards Page Bank. It's taken from up there. And again, it's spot on, whoever painted it. I don't know Robert Streeter, but you can Google him and learn all about him. His dates are interesting, because although it's late 17th century, he's dead by 1679, And I just wonder whether this was commissioned by John Cousin, who was rector of Branspeth, which is in the foreground here, Branspeth Castle to the left, in its pre-19th century condition. And this amazing garden. And this, when you look at it on site, it looks as if it's all twisted. It isn't, in fact. The ground is twisted, but the plan of it is rectangular. It's got this wonderful terrace in brick and the gazebo at the end. It really is super. We can look in a bit more detail. So that's happening just into the golf course south of the churchyard. But of course, in the background, you see focusing and somehow bringing Cousin's career into focus, as it were, is his pre-Civil War church and his post-Civil War residence as Bishop of Durham in the Cathedral. We could just be seen. Admittedly, the topography beyond looks slightly alpine. It's Pittington, isn't it? In the start, so it's a little bit more shaped than it, but it certainly would have formed the background, I think, to the tower. And it looks like pinnacles. Well, I don't know. It doesn't. I think Western towers aren't seen at all. I don't know what those things to the right are. And then the other thing. I mean, again, we're going to talk a little bit about the whole English landscape garden and the purposes of the word eyecatcher, indeed. But eyecatchers were around before the early 18th century when that concept was created. And this I find really interesting. There is an artist called Niff, and there was an engraver called Kip. Well, actually, maybe it's Knight, but I would call it Niff and Kip. And they're a pair, and they produced Illustrata Botanica or Botanica Illustrata, an amazing book in the very early years of the 18th century. They did it by a clever way. They asked the king, could they draw 6 of his palaces? He said yes. They then went round everybody saying, we're going to produce this book. It's going to have 6 of the king's gardens in it. Would you like to be in it? And of course, they all fell over backwards and said, yes, we want to be in it. And in return for subscribing, they got, let's say in modern terms, 2 or 3 A2 prints and a stack of little A4s to hand out to visiting guests and so on. That, in rough terms anyway. And they were then drawn gradually, and then Kip was engraving them. So it was published around about 1705, 1708, something like that. Anyway, all the drawings were done by 1703. We know that. And they were then passed on to Kip to engrave them. And this is Gisborough Priory, which is, and the hall rather. The hall is interesting. You wouldn't get into this book unless you had something to show off. That's the other point. And it's either your house has been extended or the garden is modern, as it were. So in this case, we've got sash windows, which are pretty state of the art in 1703 or whenever this was, might have been drawn in 1699. I don't know. Anyway, but here's the old house at the back, new wing with sash windows, and as Richard knows, Anderson House in Anderson Place in Newcastle, again, new wings of about 1690, 1700, so they're included. But also there's a posh garden here, which is very much like the Privy Garden of Hampton Court, which was the great garden which inspired everybody in the early years of the 18th century with its pyramidal yews and all the rest of it. And here, it's got some more traditional gardens here. But the thing to notice, of course, is that they've doctored the priory ruins. They cleared out whatever was left of the nave and the transepts and so on, and just left the east front. But the critical thing they've done, and they've done this, this is what 17th, more often 18th century estate owners would do, is you would doctor your ruins to create views. Go to Bolton Priory, which is of course a very famous and very picturesque ruin. It's picturesque because everywhere you go in Bolton Priory, somebody's dropped a wall to frame a view out to the churchyard, a view out to the village or the landscape. And it's just brilliantly composed because somebody has said, well, we don't want that 6-foot wall, take it out. It's not a question of ruination post dissolution. It's quite deliberate. And so here, this is quite deliberately been cut out. This is the wall behind the high altar at the east end, and it's been taken out to create this beautiful framed view of the landscape beyond. This was done before 1703. Now, it's the kind of thing later on the 18th century landscape designers and estate owners really wanted to create, but it's happening quite early on. So we've gone, well, we're in transition from, okay, the enclosed hortus conclusus, the garden where you can't see out, to seeing wider landscapes and wider views. Right, we can move properly into the English landscape tradition. This on one slide is trying to say it all, really, which is a bit tricky. Early decades of the 18th century, authors, poets, writers are writing about bringing nature into the countryside and into the garden. The garden should go beyond the confines of a walled garden, should go and this is where the ha-ha is developed, so that what is he? I'm going to do a terrible paraphrase. And the popes saw all nature was a garden, and he leapt the fence basically, and saw all nature was a garden. So you create a sunk fence, a ha-ha, so that your garden goes beyond the lawn and out into the fields, the rude countryside, as they often saw it. And we're breaking away from formality. This is a very early exercise in this by William Kent Rousham in Oxfordshire. And so you've got a little serpentine rill and a round pond, slightly formal still by the standards of Cathedral Durham later on in the 18th century. And at the same time as they were developing these designs and this new view of nature, they were collecting, these estate owners, paintings by the continental artists Lorraine, Poussin, and Sabda-Rossa. And it's very interesting. If you, I remember doing O-level history. Is it Arthur Young? Have I got the right name? Yes, the end of the 18th century was Arthur Young. Yes, who was writing all about agricultural improvements and so on. But what he was also doing when he was visiting the country estates was listing what paintings the owners had. So, for example, Cocken, which is a fascinating estate, no longer with us, but north of Finkel. He goes there in 1775, 1780, and lists all the paintings that the young Ralph Carr has collected. And he's beginning to collect Lorraines and Poussins because these paintings are inspiring what they want to do in their estates. And there's a very good illustration of Cocken as a very formal, avenued, sort of splayed design, which you can almost see from the train when you look across and you can see Cocken laid out. And that was all broken away within the 1750s and 1760s. Ralph Carr, having got some money because he married a vain lady and inherited a huge amount from her, and basically set around redesigning the landscape in a new naturalistic way, but based on these Claude Lorraine, Poussin, Sabda-Rossa illustrations. The components of this new landscape, beyond what was a flat four-walled 17th century and 16th century formal garden, you wanted something different. You wanted dramatic topography. Ideally, some cliffs, some bare rocks, something dramatic. It drifts into what is called the sublime, which we can't go into a great deal here, but it was quite nicely described as agreeable horror, which is sort of a sense that this is a slightly frightening landscape, rather than being neat and formal and tidy, and ladies in crinoline wouldn't be upset by it. You wanted to feel slightly scared. Easiest parallels to think of Victorian piers. You can walk out in a storm in a Victorian pier knowing it's safe, even though the world is crashing around you, and you get that sort of frisson of excitement, but you know you're safe. So this is agreeable horror. 20th century equivalent would be those glass centre, National Glass Centre at Sunderland, where you walk up and suddenly you realise you're walking on glass, and you think you're going to drop down into the river weir below. It's that, and they do it over canyons, don't they, with 2-inch thick glass. That's the sublime as it was understood in the 18th century, or they would have understood it with Victorian piers. And into this dramatic landscape, you need to have buildings, large and small, high and low status, particularly the counterpoint that each creates. And if possible, ruined as well, contemplative buildings reminiscent of our, Ars Longa Vita Brevis that we're passing through, and that buildings decay as we decay and so on. So things to trigger those sort of thoughts as one wandered around. Invariably water, not so much the formal canals of old, but often a more serpentine lake or a river flash, which then has to be closed off in these landscapes of Lorraines and Poussin, invariably with a bridge. You can't have the water just disappearing off around the corner. It needs to be closed by another structure of some sort. And then you use trees to judiciously frame all these views that you want to create as you perambulate around your estate. So the other thing, of course, you need access. You need to have the paths to get around these places. This is a Lorraine sketch, which will serve. We'll look at some other paintings, but you see here the water closed by the view, dramatic topography, cliffs and rocks and so on, and then high status buildings up on a hill and so on. So this is the kind of thing that, in creating their own landscapes in their own backyards, English estate owners were acquiring these continental paintings. So how did it apply in Durham? Well, this is the mid-18th century view of Durham, and by that time, and we've moved, of course, from the riverbanks being an open sewer and a quarry and all the rest of it, Just walk underneath the college to see all the open garderobe shoots coming down from the back of the west side of the college buildings, and imagine walking around there. You know, in the medieval times, it would be intolerable. Far more buildings on the riverbanks, active quarrying on the outer banks. Even Bishop Cousin tried to excavate on the inner banks, but somebody pointed out perhaps it wasn't a wise idea because his castle was above it. So very noisy, more populated. Gradually, during the course of the 18th century, 17th century, getting quieter. Problems of sanitation were improved. And by 1694, 1698, Celia Fine has come to Durham. She says the walks around the river are very pleasant. So it's beginning to be appreciated. And the history during the 18th century is greater access, greater positions where one could view these great monuments on the cathedral, on the peninsula. This, of course, is Old Prebends Bridge. This is the position where we've got this abutment on the south side still. And of course, from there, if you go there, you can't see a damn thing, basically. And it was the Great Flood of 1771, very fortuitous with hindsight, that enabled the Prebends Bridge to be brought round to this position, and that position at the west end of Prebends Bridge, where everything comes together, where it should have the flashing sign saying photo opportunity if it was Disneyland or something like that, because it is the classic. And it's not accidental, that is the point. All of this is a planned landscape. It has been with English Heritage for at least 10 or 15 years now, with their landscape team to register it as a historic landscape. I think because there's no threat. I suppose it needs the university to say we're going to fell all the trees, or the dean of chapter to say that to trigger that. But at the moment it's simply sitting in the in basket. But more urgent cases are taking precedence. So this is the medieval, sorry, the 1574 bridge, which originally was stone piers and timber superstructure, replaced the timber structure in 1696, parapets raised and so on, and then the flood took it all away. But you'll see here, this is another Poussin, from the Lorraine, I think. And again, you can see the similarities of where one is creating water. And as soon as you bring Prebends Bridge round, you've created the perfect solution whereby from one end of Prebends Bridge, you can see the great monuments, you can soften the landscape with trees, and you've closed it off at one end by Framlegate Bridge. And of course, when you're on Framlegate Bridge, it works the other way, that Prebends Bridge is visible at the southern end of that flash of water. And you created that composition is not accidental, it's quite deliberate. And just taking a few Lorraines, and you can see exactly how they're doing it. The towered structure, dramatic use of trees and framing things, bridges to close water off, in variety here at Classical Temple. And Cochrane done this rather clever thing to dismantle, not really dismantle, but for artistic purposes, to allow the eye to go into the view, this wonderful view of, and here, of course, we should make the point, including the fulling mill. The fulling mill is a counterpoint to the cathedral. It's meant to be seen. So that's what we've got. And that's what we end up with. And well, here's the point. I mean, William Kent at Rousham in the 1730s, that early garden, early natural English landscape garden that I've shown. When you go to the end of the garden, you look out over the Har and you see the immediate countryside. He wanted to dot it with interesting things in the same way that Hardwick's dotted with temples and grottos and whatever. And he didn't have a mill, so he had to build a mill. There wasn't a mill, so he built a kind of ruined Arcadian mill. And the landscape, again, comes for free in Durham. It's there already, and a perfect counterpoint to the incredibly high status cathedral above. But now it's gone. This is an oldish photograph, but it's still not visible. It's a shame. This tree, I think, is probably one that's been chopped down now. But I think from this position at the far end of Prebends Bridge, you should see both buildings. And this is where there has been concern expressed about the amount of tree cover and a proper appreciation that this is not simply a forest where we can just cut things out, but there needs to be an artistic view taken of the views of the cathedral from the immediate riverbanks. There was a thing called Durham Riverbanks Management Plan, so I'll come on to it. It seemed to die the death, possibly in COVID, I don't know, but that's Cochrane's view again, where they say the fulling mill is fully seen. This is just a one-off. I mean, we're beginning to move out to get views of the cathedral from further afield, and this is an intriguing building of which I know practically nothing. And somebody was asking me only recently, what do you know about this building? Well, it is the Belvedere, and it's up Giles Gate Bank. It's on the right-hand side. You'll know it. And what's intriguing about it is it seems to be a townhouse that has been deliberately built with its upper floors, and many Durham townhouses would have 3 floors, but basically the living was on the top floor, not so much on the first floor. You'd expect in town principal apartments, private apartments would be on the first floor in this sort of 18th century period, because of the sort of hullabaloo and hoi polloi that was going on ground level. You wanted to live above that. Here you've gone one stage higher, and on the top floor, and particularly this end room on the west side, this room has 3 Venetian windows. You can see the blank there, and you can see the shape of the original window there. These are big, high status windows. You often see them on staircase landings and so on. It's an observatory almost, just to look out and get that fantastic view across the river to the peninsula. And that's why it's called Belvedere House. Belvedere is a gazebo writ large and writ tall, basically, with an observatory, observational room at the top where one can look out. So I don't know the origins of this. I don't even know it. My recollection is it's Hilton Bede's building, and I think inside it's pretty heavily been gutted. I don't recall anything exciting about it at all inside. If it had a good staircase, it's gone. I don't know whether it was one house or was built. It looks, and one of those door cases could be a 19th century replica. We need to know more about it. It's interesting, but I'm trying to think of other examples in Durham where people are making responses to the view of the cathedral. And I know when I joined the planning office in '74, it was famously people were objecting to such and such development because it's going to obscure my view of the cathedral. And that's when, if you stood on the toilet window, and you stretched out, you could just about see it from the avenue. Well, and actually, John made a point, and I was going to respond to John on this. I remember that, I mean, people aren't entitled to a view, but where a building or a landscape is specifically designed to take advantage of a view, then there is an argument, I think, that should be protected in some ways, as we'll see here. And so I think on the planning law, you don't naturally have a right to a view, because otherwise some development would invariably come along and block that view. So you've got to have freedom to develop. But where there's a specific design intent that the building is taking advantage of a cherished view, an eye-catcher view, then there is an argument that it should be kept open, as we'll see. So we'll again begin to move out a little bit, and we've talked about Old Durham. We're going to briefly look at Newton Hall, Akeley Heads, Crook Hall, Coxo, Old Hall. Not Warton Park in this instance, but the view from Warton Park, which is a 19th century view from that sort of military bastion overlooking the station and so on. There is I think I've got it. If anybody wants to read I wrote a piece on this sort of Eyecatcher back in the day for Northumbria Gardens Trust Journal, and this is one of the maps from there. But it's covering the area. But if anybody particularly wants to read it, it's not hugely in depth. It's just saying this exists, and maybe there's other places where the cathedral is significant in the landscape. But I can send it to you. Newton Hall. Fantastic building, demolished 1928 or thereabouts. All the bits of the gazebo, I think, were hanging on into the 40s or 50s, maybe the 60s. All pretty much of that 6-year period. Top floor was added in the 1750s. I think there was a copperhead dated 1753 or 1756. So imagine it's slightly cropped, but extended. And it figures in views of the city. This is it's not coming on top left in a queue. Do you know, I was suddenly thinking today, the last time I did this thing packed in, and bless him, Richard Hurd gave me his, because I remember. So sorry you're not with us, Richard. Anyway, there it is. That's Newton Hall, and a sort of avenue to the west. Whether it was that clearly visible, I think not, but as the landscape will show. But that's where it's originally now covered in housing by Leach and Barrett and so on. But it's interesting, in as much as whatever view you saw from the house, and I think it might have been restricted. At top floor, you would get a view of the cathedral. Here is the avenue, which, as we'll see in the next photograph, was actually originally a gentle mound, and they had to cut this kind of trench down the middle, just so that when you stood at the far end, you could actually see the front of the hall. Otherwise, you practically see most of it was hidden. But you then descended down two stepped gardens, and it's this garden which is most interesting, this terrace, which runs along the side below the avenue, because this is still very much there. I mean, you know, Leach would smooth out some things, but I'll tell you now that you can go and walk around, and we're going to do this in June. You can still walk along one road and you just go down in a dip, and you're going down that dip of the avenue, which was laid out in the early 18th century. Part of this garden still survives as an open land behind some houses, and of course some of these outbuildings still survive behind this, which is Blanchman Close, I think it's called, which is the street. And whenever I've led parties around there, we go and stand outside somebody's house, and we just try to imagine an 18th century mansion. I warn them in advance we're going to stand and look at their house. But yes, so it's this terrace, which is a response to a sort of lower terrace, which is affording the view. So as you perambulate up and down your terrace, you will get that view straight down the valley to the cathedral. That's a really early photograph of the county record office, I think. And this is this natural hill. And you can see that until the avenue was carved out of it, you would only just probably barely see the top floor of Newton Hall. So I suspect, looking back, and particularly with these trees on the south side, from the house, you wouldn't necessarily see the cathedral. You'd have to go out into the gardens, down and along that terrace. And these are the plans. These are all now Liddell plans. This is Henry Liddell writing in letters and sending plans to his son John Bright. John Liddell, who married into the Bright family in Yorkshire. And as all young men did, if they inherited a fortune from their wives, they happily changed and took their name. So the Brights moved in, and the Bright papers all get swept up into the Wentworth Woodhouse muniments, which are in Sheffield. Wentworth Woodhouse, that unbelievable house, which if you've never been, go and see it. It's just about the biggest country house in the country, massively long facade. And so all the things that we want to know about Newton Hall are all in Sheffield, basically, and fantastic lot of papers, including this, which is a plan of the avenue. The house is here. That's the front court. This is the avenue, cut to that hillside, and then trees planted. But here, there was going to be what I can only would call it a rond-point. Think of the Arc de Triomphe and sitting in the middle of 8 roads, all converging on one point. And the original plan here would have been to have a central point, and then to cut alleys through the trees to view, all this lot. Now, in theory, starting from here and going clockwise, we've got the entrance drive, we've got Gateshead Windmills here to the north, Lumley Castle to the sort of northeast. Then the avenue continues here, and then Keepier Grange and Cassop Hills, Keepier and Gilesgate Church, Durham Abbey, i.e. the cathedral, here, and then back to the avenue again. That is the way it was planned. It was never executed, I don't think. There's no evidence that it was executed, and I suspect it probably didn't work, because to imagine that all those features are perfectly arranged at, 45 degrees as one goes around the circle seems unlikely to me. But it was an aspiration, and popular, and these sort of things were popular at the time. And you go to Bramham in North Yorkshire, which is a great early 18th century landscape, and there are these wonderful sort of diverting paths that are cutting through the woodland and so on. Not too far away, Akeley Heads. Now this is a complex building. It's never been properly studied. It's now got some wonderful 18th century Rococo, mid-18th century Rococo work in this room, which was the registry, I think, until recently, and that's now moved to Mount Oswald. Is this a restaurant now? It's gone back as a restaurant, or somebody's taken it as a restaurant. Anyway, because somebody said that it wasn't an appropriate use. I don't know, but what there was, anyway, was this strangely meandering house plan. The older part of the house is to the north. And what we do know of the chronology is that this part, which is this ground floor room, was possibly a detached building. This is a theory from Simpson and Brown, who were the architects for, I'm trying to think of them. There's a gentleman, who did the conversion of this wonderful conversion and restoration of it. And this may have been a single story detached building. This is the theory, at least, to be examined, and that it was linked to the house by the building, the block behind, which is a later early 19th century staircase. So imagine that in order to bring the detached banqueting house into the body of the main house, you get this slightly dog-legging, meandering house plan. It's not compact at all. It would make sense. And then later in the 19th century, this was added on top. So you rather lost it in terms of what it was, which would have been a detached banqueting house with this kind of framed view down the lawn, woodland both sides, framing that view straight down to the cathedral. And that with a ha-ha as well, just to make sure that view is not interrupted and so on. Inside, of course, it's just drop dead gorgeous. This is I'm probably, well, we could debate it, but I mean it is not as big as what is it now? St Anne's Court, which was Castle Chair Art Centre and so on, the big building down at Frammelgate. It's not as big, but in its perfect form. It's also got original glass in its. Oh, that was quite new, but anyway, it had a lot of original glass in its mirrors. Perfect mid-18th century Rococo work, and it was, I think, it was steam cleaned. I mean, the fire did a lot of damage. Not in this room. The fire actually had the effect of burning off a lot of the layers of paint, but the plasterwork remained untouched. Slightly different, but an equally a vantage point to get a view of the cathedral is Crook Hall. There is at the top of the garden this sort of niche. It looks sort of late 17th, probably 18th century brick with a little lamp niche of some sort there. And this sits at the top of the garden, and down the garden again. This is, we'd have seen more of the cathedral because it's shrouded rather in its belfry stage at this point. Another view, a clear view, I think, of the cathedral as an eye catcher. Further out to the south, Coxall Hall Wood, which City Council bought and started to do things with, now with the County Council. And it also looks a bit like the Loch Ness Monster to me, but here's, you've got this strange estate which goes up. Here's the body of the hall, open lawn to the south. There was a DMV, a medieval village going down to a mill down here. Walled garden, and these basic lines of the estate were recreated by the City Council, so you can still walk along these routes to this day. And I'm not sure this was ever fully opened up, but there was a path called Ladies' Walk, which went up to the top of the hill. At the top of there, you're at the back of the quarry. And from that vantage point, whereas there was a trig point there, this is 1857, first edition OS, there was a view across the landscape down to see Durham Cathedral in the landscape below us, as along the lines that Jean Woodward's photograph showed us. So this was a deliberate walk out from the estate purely to gain that vantage point to see the eye catcher of the cathedral in the background. Further out still, a bit more to the south and to the south east, is Ferry Hill. And this is interesting because in Ferry Hill lived the Boulbys. The Boulbys were a legal family. They lived at the Old Hall, which we'll come on to look at in a minute. And they worked a lot for the Dean of Chapter. They must have had some offices, I think, in the Bailey and been popping in and out of the college all the time in the 18th century. And their good friend was Canon Joseph Spence, who was this very important man who designed the landscapes at Auckland and Raby, almost certainly, I think, appointed by the bishop, although I've never quite understood how bishops appoint their canons, but I think he was almost certainly appointed because of his skills as a landscape architect, particularly as Bishop Trevor had just taken an interest in Auckland. And if he said, well, if he can do a decent sermon and be pastoral and all and tick all the other boxes, and he's a landscape architect as well, maybe we should have him in Durham for the 7th stall, which had then become vacant. So in 1754, Joseph Spence arrives and is immediately told to go to Auckland and design a landscape. Probably didn't get a chance to do a sermon before he was whipped off to Auckland. Later on did Raby, and then did a number of smaller landscapes around. One of which is Mr. Boulby's house in Ferry Hill. And we didn't know quite where that was, but then we know the plan because he did a plan, and this is his plan, and all these documents are now in Yale University. Fortunately, if you compare it with the OS map, something leaps out straight away, which is the National School in 1857, later the Masonic Lodge, Rowlandston Masonic Lodge. And this is the plan, and there are notes to go with this in which Joseph Spence is asking the Bulbys, do you like these kind of fruit trees? Is Mrs. Bulby a gardener? Does she like these? It's very usual sort of client sort of question that you would ask before you design a landscape. And on the flat, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a sort of formal garden, flower garden, vegetable garden. Then it comes to the slope, and this top third is sloping down to the north. And you get this very clever device, which you will see a view out, and then you take a path left or right, which leads you around into a little grotto. These are tree plantings here, thinner planting here, and leads you to a seat, which is facing another seat over here. And from both those seats, you're looking north, you will see the cathedral tower. And from the main body of the village, you don't see it, you have to go outside to the north of the garden. At some point, they obviously did away with that, even if it was ever executed, and they just went for a straightforward repetition of the rectangular structure. But on the plan, that top third is actually on a steep slope going down. So again, this is Joseph Spence. He also designed the gardens at Seddersfield Hall, and some mysterious gardens. There are some. He was also involved with accessing the riverbank paths, because he's the man who was, I was told by Michael Tooley, planted the trees below the castle in the 1750s. I've never found any documents for this, and sadly Michael's no longer with us, but there is a whole stash of plans and drawings at Yale which are unattributed, just loose papers they couldn't find a site for. And by good fortune, I got a copy of this, scrolled through it, and there is certainly a writing, well, apart from the fact that Spence was certainly involved in Cockham, which is interesting in itself, but there is certainly a list of footpath lengths that in Spence's handwriting, describing Gilly Gate, the mill, to the journey to the mill, and it's somewhere he's been asked, I think, as a practical designer by the Dean and Chapter in laying out new paths around the riverbanks just to work out the lengths of the paths. And I think I was always told later on that Canon Tristram, that famous canon, 19th century canon, who shot everything on sight, didn't he, and stuffed it. I remember there's a wonderful, he was a great botanist, but he did kill stuff, zoologist rather. But that's the great thing they did in the 19th century. The Dean Chapter, they developed public footpaths around the riverbank so that these views would come into view, would be framed as they intended. They weren't sort of private walks. This is what it looks like now. Well, it did. And then annoyingly, Masonic Lodge took down the only external reminder that this is an 18th century house of an 18th century wall with a nice stone coping, and put up something nasty in modern brick. There are fragments inside. There's an old staircase, late 18th, early 19th century, and a few panel doors. Otherwise, it had a 1920s makeover, but that is the old hall where Joseph Spence designed his garden. And we're talking about Spence, and Joseph Spence, he was the canon of the 7th stall, and as part of the 7th stall, you've got Finkel in your estate. So his country retreat was the farmhouse at Cockham, and he talks about that in his letters. And he arranged to have a little extension built, and there's a fine 18th century bay window looking out on the sequestered walks of Cockham. And of course, this side is Cockham, and all this footpath and all this revetment work and this retaining wall was built by Ralph Carr to enjoy the sublime landscape that you can enjoy if you walk inside. The rocks are hanging over you and so on. And so that was what Ralph Carr was spending his wife's money on in the 1750s. But getting advice from Joseph Spence, who was also, as I say, possibly distressing a bit of Finkel at the same time. But again, in terms of framing views, and this time here is, and this is my only sort of contextual side, because I mean, obviously all these, think of Studley Royal. You go to Studley Royal, and the culmination of Studley Royal as you arc round that valley is to see fountains in the background as the Eyecatcher. The ruin is brought in more dramatically. It's done at Revo Terrace, where those cuts are cut in the woodland on that, again, that crescent of a sort of shelf of land where views down to the Abbey. So these are bringing in existing ruins, and here at Cockham, what happens is that Spence and Ralph Carr have contrived a perambulation which brings you down to here, but you emerge through the woodland, having descended from the road, to the surprise view of the ruins of Finkel Abbey, Fingal Priory, which were not in Spence's gift. They weren't in his land. The river's the boundary, but he's using them as an eye catcher in the landscape. And here, this is a very famous double vista, which again is mentioned in Spence's notes, that we can identify this scribbled note when he's walking around a landscape, because he talks about double vista and views to the priory. It's got to be Cockham, and he's advising the young Ralph Carr. Spence was old at this time. Ralph Carr was young and had the money and wanted to know how to spend it. This is a double vista which was actually shaped through the trees, one to see one bend of the river. The river is coming around here, and here you can just make out the spire of Chester Street Church. Quite a common eye catcher in the landscape in its own right. These are two drawings from Alnwick. There are equivalent paintings later on, still in Raby. I think a gift from Ralph Carr to the Vanes, saying basically, this is what I spent your daughter's money on, because he couldn't have done it without the Vanes' money, I don't think. Finally, just bringing it up to date, and still the cathedral has some eye catcher value. Thomas Sharp's plan of 1944 had some, well, of course, this is Hildon Bede here, and there were some plans for colleges on the banks going down, which would have had enjoyed views of the cathedral. Interestingly, the bit they always keep quiet about in Thomas Sharp's plan, he wanted to clear most of the top of Claypath, and there isn't a single building on Gilesgate down here. He saw it as a hilltop to go on to admire the views, like sort of Highgate or something, and admire the views of the city. And this was very common after the war. John Pendlebury's written some stuff on this at Newcastle University. I come from Chester, and the Chester 1944 plan had swathes of medieval buildings swept away on the flank of the city wall, so that you could see the wall laid out and a nice green sward in front of it. And I think that must have happened in York. When you look at some of the York views of the city walls, you wonder whether there weren't buildings in front of it which were cleared away to get a better view and so on. But what happened, of course, was that we did, at least when they were developing south of the river, get St Mary's College. This is an early study by Vincent Harris, great architect, a wonderful building. One that I remember has been on the provisional list for listing for donkey's years, with the advice to me at the time, about 30 years ago, from Elaine Harwood, that if ever anything happens to St Mary's or Dunelm House or Kingsgate Bridge, just let us know and we'll list it straight away. Well, we did when Kingsgate Bridge was threatened slightly by a bad lighting scheme, but fortunately, St Mary's has always been well looked and cared for. But this is an early study. The chapel never happened, of course, and after, this is pre-war study. After the war, it grew and grew and grew, and lots of dormers sprouted. It's still a magnificent building, but of course it enjoyed this fantastic view, looking, this is later, but looking down onto the flank of the cathedral, the south flank, which is a spectacular view. As was eventually achieved at Grey College. This was the time when Thomas Sharp was being consulted on changes and the new buildings that are coming along. He was the external consultee, and I always feel sorry for people like Architects Co-Partnership who had to do Dunelm House. They not only had to satisfy the city council, the county council, but their appointed advisor, Thomas Sharp. So there were people coming from all sides advising on this. And I've never seen the early studies for Grey College. I would say that when I did the book on the university, finding early studies or even finding final drawings is very difficult. There is an entire building stashed full of files at down on the racecourse, full of all the sort of bathroom fittings out of Aden, tedious post-contract drawings, but those early drawings where people are conceiving of the colleges and playing around with different forms, which would be vital to writing a really good book on the university, they're not there. What we do know is that Sharp said there is a great view to be had from Grey College, and the way they were clustered together, he said, you need to separate them out and allow that view from Hollinside Lane, that shaft, to go down and see the flank of the cathedral again. And so that is why Grey College is split, and there's a sort of 50-yard gap between the two main blocks of buildings, so that you get that framed view of the cathedral, unlike St Mary's, but this is slightly more to the east. And so again, using the cathedral as the fourth side, as it were, in the landscape. Spence didn't really do this, even though he had the best site. I mean, Windmill Hill is a high hill, and he was on top of it. But in fact, the only building that really is I think that's a library. There is a sort of glancing view out of there to the cathedral, but of course, all the way that top terrace is magnificent. But in some ways, Spence was slightly obsessed with what was happening inside his college, because what he really wanted to do was have a chapel at the south end that would be the focus. And of course, it never achieved. That would have been it. It was rather like the Coventry Cathedral side chapels, but university funding was always for buildings, for residential accommodation, dining rooms and so on. There was never any national funding for the chapel. And the chapel, they had a special fund for it. It raised something like £4 in 6 months. It was pathetic, the amount of money it raised, even though he made a desperate plea when they opened the college. Please, can I have £10,000 for the chapel? Nobody came forward. And so it's there's still a gap there. And finally, bringing it right sort of up to date, certainly when I was around and James Burland was the architect, partner in charge at Arabs, when Howlands Farm College is what it got known as, now late Josephine Butler. The brief for this site, which was very green and focused, was saying, don't take any topsoil off the site. And most people would spread the topsoil off, do the buildings, and then bring it back and spread it around the gardens and so on. And James Burland thought there was so much topsoil to scrape off, why don't we mound it all up and make a sort of, in the manner of an Elizabethan mount, a view back to the cathedral, because we're moving further and further south down South Road. So building colleges like Trevelyan and Collingwood don't really have any opportunity to look back to the cathedral in the same way that Mary's and Gray's did. I've seen one sketch of Trevelyan where there's a little sort of archway and a view through, and the cathedral is framed, but it's not really planned, I don't think. It's accidental. Collingwood is looking complete the wrong way. And of course, normally Josephine Butler is miles away from the cathedral, but by having this mound, and by completely orientating this line at the approach road coming in off South Road down here, it was going to be through modern buildings, the sort of central buildings here. That still exists. This rather went the way, the university kind of abandoned Arabs, with great shame. This would have been a lovely scheme with a necklace of loose, small, quite traditional looking in some ways blocks, but really nice. I know the vents system, this passive ventilation system didn't work, but that wasn't any reason for getting rid of Arabs. They went with somebody who was local, and they doubled the density and put in pretty boring blocks. And so this is the only bit of Arabs phase one that actually survived. But it was its focus back to the cathedral, which is making this, was reviving that tradition of the Eyecatcher in the landscape. Very quickly, there was a brilliant, I thought, anyway, I joined in August 74, and Tony Scott had already got through the council in the first meeting of the year, a 2-page, this is what you must do if you build in Durham guide. Now it's all wrapped up in you know, county plan, something else, but it was jolly useful to say to a developer, this is what we want you to do. The dominance of the cathedral, the green of the mound of the castle, the skyline buildings, and nothing should intrude upon the great views, blah, blah, blah. Just in 2 sides of A4. And it's still around, but it's rather blasted to every single policy in the county plan now. And then towards the end, 1997, 99, when I was there, left in 1999, Riverbank's management plan was a great vehicle for bringing together the various components and seeing the cathedral in the light of its setting and the riverbanks. Great shame that disappeared for whatever reason, and will no doubt illuminate us why. It should go back, I think, because I think the way the riverbanks are managed needs to be done in an artistic way, where views and so on are very carefully considered, and possibly some tree felling done judiciously to keep those views open. Durham Bowl, access and a circular walk. Well, this was achieved by David Miller, I think, with the Trust and Durham Parish, and that wonderful guided walk leaflet they've done. We only got as far as negotiating with the university to provide the Mountjoy access path, and we did commission Royston Thompson. Somewhere there's a wonderful set of Royston's illustrations. He walked right the way around, starting at sort of Neville's Cross and going right the way around through to Peel Woods, doing those wonderful shots he does. So this, which is where we started, ended up being this view from Winnie Hill. And the beauty of Winnie Hill, I've not done it for 30 years, and I hope you can still do it. When Winnie Hill School was there, before the housing was built, you used to be able to walk on the blind side of Winnie Hill, and I wrote about this in the introduction to the Durham book, and you could be in a hollow where you couldn't see the town at all. There were some cows, I think cows are vitally important in this city. We need them close in. There was a time when you walked from Claypath onto the marketplace and you looked across the bridge, you looked right towards Durham station, and there were cows grazing below the station. I think we should get them back, I mean, I don't know whether they're there, but just you get a Northern Arts thing to get them back, or our plastic ones. No, but to be able to have that vital link to the countryside, and you could do this here, and you couldn't even see the town at all. You were in this hollow, and you could have been in Upper Weardale, and then you see 6 trees on the horizon, on the top of Winnie Hill. Des Kelly, as many of you will know, told me I think there were 8 originally, and we'd lost 2. And then you would walk up, and you wouldn't see any building at all. And then suddenly, as you walk up towards these 6 trees, the cathedral just looms into view like this. You really need an orchestra playing Sibelius or Mahler as well, and in a perfect world you'd have that. But I mean, the tingle you get down your spine as you walk up Money Hill, and this building just rears up in front of you is stunning. And Royston captured that in that photograph. And there I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. We learned before we started that you had to wait for this to wake up. That was the reason for the pause there. Martin, that was wonderful. Thank you very, very much indeed. We're now going to attempt to follow that with something a little bit different. Because of the implications of what Martin has been saying for the development of the setting study of the World Heritage Site, we're going to have a small panel and encourage discussion which focuses on setting study, but you can also ask anything you want to ask as well. Don't feel constrained. So if I can invite panelists, please, to come out and introduce them. Martin, of course, will be on the panel too. And just passing by there's Anne Allen, who is the Senior Manager for the World Heritage Site. And passing next to me now, Michael Hurler, one of our trustees, who for many years, both professionally and voluntarily, has been involved with the World Heritage Site. Now I'm going to start, first of all, by handing out microphones. Martin, you're still.
I'm okay, yeah.
Oh, provide in a minute time. And Matthew? Yeah, fragile Matthew Phillips is going to be the roving mic. If you want to speak. All right. Come on. When you get the mics, hold it right up to your mouth so that you will work. I think that's the preparation. So I'm going to start by asking Michael for some brief reflections on what we've just heard from Martin.
Well, as ever, it was both very entertaining, very illuminating talk from Martin. What was interesting about it is that the number of times that I've been involved myself in trying to look at views of the cathedral and where from. But what Martin did there was to actually add a lot of meat behind a lot of the kind of more basic facts of where you can see from. And probably when we start to look forward at the setting study that's just come through, and then the World Heritage Site, SPD, that's coming out, what there is there is that same kind of technical aspect of just looking at what views are and not necessarily catching them all. But what Martin's done is actually throw us back into some of the reasons why other parts around Durham are very, very important, why other views are very, very important. And one only has to also think of the meaning of the way that pilgrimage, reflected on those points as well. You know, as you came into Durham, where you could see the cathedral pond was obviously that ruling point. You know, that was a key thing, the achievement of the pilgrimage. And if you add that into the mix, I think probably somewhere in the way we're looking at it now, we're missing something of this. And I think that's where Martin's talk kicks in. And I think that's actually a very, very useful background to a lot of what we've been talking about recently.
Thanks, Michael. Now I invite Anne to say a few words, which will perhaps focus a little bit more towards the setting study.
Okay, well, first of all, to say thank you to the Trust and to John for inviting me to be part of this afternoon's session. I do feel a bit like the novice. I first met Martin in 1989 when I was an undergraduate student and I was digging at Old Durham because we were cheap clearance, I think, rather than council employees. Well, that turned into an excavation which was published in Durham Archaeological Journal. And we've stayed in touch off and on ever since. And I've always been impressed by his encyclopedic knowledge and the amazing way that he gives great insight, but tells a great story and such enthusiasm. And I hope one day to be able to speak with such eloquence. I think Martin has given us a really good insight into the history and a real sense that this is a place that is continually changing, continually evolving, and therefore it's very hard to capture our moment in time and say that is what we're going to preserve, that's what we're going to go back to. So there are 3 pieces of work going on at the moment, very much with the local authority planning and conservation team at the helm, but they're on holiday this weekend, so you've got me instead. So one of those is the new city conservation area management plan. And you will know from the consultation that came out, the first phase of consultation last year, that the proposal is to have 7 conservation areas. So there's a strategic overarching document and then 7 conservation areas, and very, very detailed character appraisals have been written on each of those 7 areas. And I've been kind of proofreading them, and I've just finished the Jarlsgate one, so it's quite apposite that you ended with Jarlsgate and Hillbead, because threaded through those new character appraisals are lots of maps showing the viewpoints that are important and capturing them. So we're going to have that in much more detail than we've ever had before in those new documents. Each one of those character appraisals is about 140 pages long, so it's a bedtime read. The second thing that we've been doing, which John's alluded to there, is the setting study. So this was a piece of work which was commissioned from Chris Blanford Associates about a year ago. They presented a very, very long report and a huge chunk of what they called the vantage point analysis, with lots of new photography all marked up, showing, you know, what you can see from different locations. But it went beyond the idea of just viewpoints to present something new, which was to talk about experience zones, the way in which we experience something which is kinetic, it moves, it's multi-sensory, it's not just about what you see. And we're beginning to think about what you hear, you know, so you might have seen a programme for World Heritage Day this year about the sounds of World Heritage Sites. And there are lots of recordings done from different places around the world. And of course, sound is incredibly important in Durham. You get the bells, you get the sound of choral practice, you get the sound of the choristers playing in the playground as you go up onto the peninsula. So there's a piece of work, I think, still to be done about the soundscape of the World Heritage Site. And then the third piece of work is the World Heritage Site Management Plan, which will draw on or signpost to all of these other documents. But a key thing that we want to have in place before we present that to UNESCO is to have something we've not had before, which is supplementary planning guidance for the World Heritage Site and its setting, that sets all of this out clearly, but in a way that gives advice and a sort of toolkit approach for developers and architects of the future to think about what they should take into consideration when they're designing and in dialogue with the authority from the outset. So that in a nutshell is sort of how this is evolving. And just very briefly to answer the point you made about the riverbank gardens and management, the Cathedral has just been doing a piece of consultation led by the Wildlife Trust to look at how we should manage the gardens for a place for today and for the future. And so it is forward looking. We have got the 4 areas of the gardens and designed landscape of the World Heritage Site protected on the local list, and they're protected by virtue of being part of the setting study. But we are very much thinking about how do we need to make those spaces work for people today.
Thank you, Anne. It's a very comprehensive nutshell. So, over to you. Would anyone like to comment on the talk, ask questions about the setting study, etc., John?
Is it on? Yes, please, thank you. Question of views and private and public views and which ones matter. Esther and I have a private view of the cathedral, which you can't have, sorry. But the point that Martin made about deliberately designed views are entitled to protection, raised for the trust. An interesting question in views from the restaurant of Durham Hospital, when a huge student block was proposed that would prevent that view. And thanks to Roger Cornwall, that point succeeded, and the developers were forced or requested and agreed to drop the roof line so that the view was retained. And I think that kind of public-private chance to take another line on where the cathedral, what's it like from this point of view, is important. And I'll finish on a sort of question with an example. When County Hall was built, the chief operative bit faces the cathedral, and the person who had a hand in the landscaping around County Hall, Dick Atkinson, was granted the 4th floor office precisely because he would get the best view. And it isn't true that the architect was put on the 5th floor to look down and think he was superior. So the question is there any scope at all, from what Anne was saying, which is absolutely wonderful, good stuff, is there any scope at all for trying to capture private sort of public views that have been deliberately provided of the cathedral and the World Heritage Site, or is that asking too much, do you think? Thank you.
Do you want to have a go at that, Martin?
No, no, well, yes, I mean, I can see the restaurant argument, and I have to probably apologise to John, but John did ask me about this question, and I was thinking of Achy Heads is a good example. I think a building, I think, which was meant to enjoy that view. You wouldn't want to block the view from what was then the registry. Right, I mean, and then the flip side of that is to say that private houses that accidentally have a view, and appreciate you've got a wonderful view, but I mean, nobody's going to build it from the view, John. But I mean, I think what I'm saying is that everybody in the city can't be entitled to a view. That's a fundamental planning principle. But where there is a communal or public design intent, then I think there's an argument for it. And I'm glad you put your argument to driving. But there's plenty of others. I mean, but then doing extended Palatine House, and didn't the Vice Chancellor have a view over the top of Palatine House that looked north over Church Street and Horndale Street to the cathedral? You know what I'd like to do with Palatine House?
Any others? Douglas?
Thank you very much. From what I just heard from the panel and Martin's scholarship, I think the trust would be missing a trick if it didn't say that it had published 2 things of some importance this afternoon. One, it published a CD cassette of half an hour called Sounds of a Cathedral City. 2, it has published a booklet on the paintings of Durham which takes viewpoints all around the bowl. Of course, it depicts the paintings and it depicts today's pictures. And I might, in parentheses, say that the World Heritage Centre refuses to sell it. And going back to Martin's talk, the question of leaves in trees and so on, over the last 2 years that I've seen South Street, one should look at South Street and views of South Street from the cathedral. Quite what the residents are doing, I don't know, because the trees have grown up tremendously from the South Street allotment. They must be moving other store as they did in Bellevue in the old area. The other thing is, another example of that is Bryadine. The townhouse is designed by Donald Insall, he was quite proud of that, with a wonderful view of the cathedral down across the allotment to unimpeded view of the cathedral. Unfortunately, the landscape included trees, and now the last few house agents' advertisements have said seasonal view.
I could just add about South Street. I remember once when I was working at the planning office, it was in the 90s, I guess, walking along South Street with John Williamson, doing a chapter who was land agent, as many of you remember, very professional man. His background, however, was forestry and National Trust in the lakes. And if you stand directly opposite the west front, and the back of you is what I always regard was Miss Wilkinson's house, which was the one that was threatened with student accommodation, and she had this oriel window, which is absolutely on the axis, and of course, Old Durham's on the other side of the view. And there used to be a sort of a cleft in the trees, and you could see that west front. And gradually, as Douglas said, the trees get, and one perfect, I think it's a beech or an oak, it's still there, I'm sure, stood right in the middle. And I said to John, just take that out, we could get that shaft of light to see the west front of the cathedral. It's a really good tree, one of the best trees on the riverbank. It's perfect beech, you see. He had his forestry background. He said, I'll create a view further along. And he did argue that as you walk towards Pimlico, he'd create a kind of shaft where you could get this view, but it wasn't the head-on view. And I would argue, and at the same time, of course, as we were walking along South Street, one or two residents would pop up, oh, Mr. Williams, could you possibly take that branch off? Because I can't see it in my living room and it's obscure in the west front. And that's why loads of people, we got a lot of dormer applications on South Street, because people were moving up to their dormers so they could get above the tree line and still see the west front. But that's an argument, not necessarily for removing all the trees to please the residents, but selected views along that run along South Street should be kept open, I think.
The whole question of trees and their blocking of views is now really quite serious. Martin's just talked about the South Street view. I have a photograph taken 50 years ago this coming autumn, where you've got a lovely view of the west end of the cathedral. And it's always seemed to me rather disgraceful that most of that land below South Street is actually Dean and Chapter land. And what has been just allowed to grow up, mostly I suspect with weed trees, over the last 50 years, and they have not bothered to preserve what was a really spectacular view. But this applies all over the city. They have, I don't know who actually got round to cutting down the weed trees above the Highgate development, which had not been there more than 20 years, over this last winter. So from the lookout, as you come down from the station, you can actually sit there and see the cathedral again, which for several years you had not been able to do, except in the winter. But I live in Victoria Terrace. I've lived in that house all my life. And in the old days, I could see not only the whole of the west end of the cathedral, but you could see the river mist rising a la St Cuthbert, and the saving of Durham Cathedral in 1942 on the night of the bombers. But now I cannot actually see the cathedral at all in the summer, even from the top floor of my house. And I can barely see the viaduct, which is after only a few hundred yards away, for trees that have grown in the last few seasons. And people, I have neighbours who have 20 years ago said, oh, well, we like the green. And my mother did query whether they needed to let all these young trees grow. I've now got an enormous cherry backed by an even taller young copper beech. But the trouble is how people come in and out of the houses and they're not going to bother to haggle with the council about cutting them down. But this is a problem all over the city. And I don't think that you can now see the view from the way, which was put at the top of Wharton Park after the Garden Festival in 1980 something, was it? And certainly from Wharton Park, you can see practically nothing. I went up to look at trains. In 1975, at the time of the sesquicentenary of the railways, there were 4 steam excursions on the successive Sundays of September, and you could stand on the slope below the lookout, and you could see right round to where the trains came out of the cutting, all the way up to beyond the station. And now you can see practically nothing, because the railway people have allowed a huge block of trees to grow up between the platform and the enormous fence that the council have put in, so nobody can actually drop onto the railway. All the trees above Parkside, sort of above Station Bank, are now absolutely massive and completely block out the view along the viaduct. And you'd only actually see anything if you managed to get up onto the top of it, which on a day of a steam excursion, you probably have to get there the night before to be able to see anything. And I really think this is something that the council, I suspect they have a total preservation idea about trees, but a great many of these trees are weed trees that have grown in the matter of 15, 20 years, quite apart from the ones the council have planted on roadsides and so on in the last 50. But it really is a major problem. And if one wants to preserve some of these views, I think the council is going to have to get their mind round the felling of weed trees, and sycamores are definitely weed trees.
Just say on the way, I do remember when we installed that, we approached Gateshead and said, do you have any sculptures left over? And they had a big warehouse. We selected what was called Ion then, because it was across the river in the Gateshead Festival. I've got Hamish, I can't remember his second name, the sculptor, Hamish Hamilton, anyway, he was commissioned and he came to Durham to set it out. We said, look, this is your sculpture at Gateshead, would you like to set it out? And he obviously liked the idea of pointing it at the cathedral tower, logical thing to do. And to facilitate that, we actually chopped some trees out, because it was that crescent where Neptune used to be lower down, and you just take out some trees so that and that taking them out, you actually frame the cathedral tower. And it worked very nice. And he liked it so much he called it the Way, because he wanted it to be a pilgrimage sort of idea, rather than Aeon or whatever it was, which was a bit of an abstract view from beyond. So it's certainly possible, I would have thought. So. And I would have thought, I mean, we've had the conversation about Old Durham. Jed Lawson, I mean, head of you know, his father, and Jed's inherited his father's sensitivity to landscape and sculpture and all the rest of it. Jed's totally on board with the concept of us taking trees down at Old Durham. It's going to be quite dramatic. It would need to be managed to take out 20 trees, because people say, oh, they're felling trees in Vila Woods. Now we'd have to kind of say this is why we're doing it. But I mean, I think he's totally, it's a question of funding, of course. But I mean, the small question of taking a scallop of trees out to frame the view of Ion, of the Way, I would have thought was perfectly possible. And I would have thought they would be very amenable to. Funding is going to be an issue, of course, that who does it and how it's funded, but desirable, absolutely.
Because back to comment, he has a landscape background.
Thank you. So there was actually an interim project with Cathedral Woodlands, which did do some work. But what we've lacked all through the years is, even for the more significant blocks of land, is some comprehensive idea of where the trees are. We all know where they are because we see them. You see them from views, you see them everywhere. But there was never the resource back in the days of the city council to actually pull it together and actually come together with some kind of comprehensive understanding of just where the major blocks of trees were, where the issues might be, where the views might be. And I think now that prospect of introducing something like that is receding even further. The chances of actually even just collecting together the ownerships, understanding where they are, understanding where the trees are, welding that together, is an enormous task. And you can understand why the individual greater block owners through the university, the colleges, the dean chapter have tended to actually scrub that to one side, because it's now reverted, I think, very much to thinking that those areas on riverbanks, as an example, are the backyard again, that they're not in such active use as to actually promote some kind of greater degree of care. And how we can actually achieve that, I don't know. Underlying that, I do think, as you just alluded to what Jed Lawson thinks, I don't think there are any inherent problems in the people who may control these things or understand them or permit them to stopping trees being felled where they need to go from. But there is actually that enormous problem underneath that of actually getting the groundwork together to understand where we're going with it, and then the resources to do anything about it.
And also the agriculturists of the county are on board, because there's a theme sometimes, and this was fueled by Tony Smith's experience of the county in trying to do Hardwick. He tried to do, they did a management plan for Auckland Castle, and David Jenkins was the bishop, and that never took off because there was going to be so much felling going on in order, because there are meant to be planned views of seeing Auckland and the chapel through the trees. And exactly the same happened at the Hardwick when you analyse Hardwick, and Nick Owens and all the research on it, and the amount of felling that had to go on. And unfortunately, at the time, the arboriculturist at Sedgefield felt his job was to save every tree, irrespective of how important it was. Just, I've got to save every tree, full stop. So we had battle royal. Now that's not, we thought we would have trouble at Old Durham with the arboriculturists at Old Durham. I'm totally on board. And so in that sense, it's Lee Hall, I forget the name, the arboriculturist's name, and Jed, I think, are in principle accepting the need that the planned vistas of the cathedral should be preserved. And if that means selling, it's just a question of how you do it. And if these trees have been coppiced before, then they should be coppiced and ready. Every 20, 30 years.
Is there anything in the setting study about trees before we move on?
Well, if I can offer a little bit of hope, within the World Heritage Site Management Plan, one of our themes for the next phase up to 2035 is actually about increasing public access to green space and bringing back into use and into greater use some of the gardens within the World Heritage Site boundary, but also the designed landscape setting. And the piece of consultation which the cathedral has just led is with a view to, getting an opinion on board to do some more active management on the regenerate plants. So I think we will see it, but I think we'll see it not as one huge joined up project necessarily, but as nibbling away in different areas, improving, keep, as you said, Martin, key views.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor, particularly any not to do with trees?
I was just going to make a very quick point about trees, for the trees. I think if you're going to have a process like that, you do also then have to have a process of creating more woodland. And I take that as the example, the Woodland Trust development of Low Birdwell Wood, which has been an absolute wonderful addition to the city. So if you want to have a programme of tree felling for views, which obviously lots of people are supporting, I think we should also have in parallel a programme of development of more marvellous woods around the city.
Thank you, Sue. Anyone else? Esther?
Just a very quick comment, if I may. There was some concern voiced recently, I think, about the public's lack of awareness about the lighting of the beacon, if it was to be lit for the VE Day celebrations. And that arose because of the sighting of the beacon, and I'm raising it now because it may be an issue for the future with the redevelopment of the Akeley Heads Business Park, because that's where the beacon is at the moment, on the mound next door to County Hall. And that came about because people will be aware that the beacon was donated to the parish council by the freemen of the city. And it got to the point where the man in his forge was busy building the beacon, and we didn't have anywhere to put it. So there was a meeting in the obvious place, high in the city centre, visible to everybody, Wharton Park. And the trouble with that is, beacon is a fire, and Wharton Park is trees, largely. And we spent a great deal of time walking around Wharton Park with the county council officers of 2 or 3 different teams who were all very much involved in the project, trying to find somewhere where we would stick this beacon. And there wasn't anywhere. And we eventually found the perfect place, patch of green. You could have people all around the edge watching, until the officers pointed out that that side of the beacon was the gap in the trees, so that everybody in Wharton Park had a view of the cathedral. And behind us were the 3 benches which had been put there specifically so that people could enjoy this view. trees and Durham is an ongoing issue. Beacon is going to be an ongoing issue, and I hope somebody can solve that problem, because where it is at the moment isn't very publicly visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Any other comments or questions? No, well, can I conclude by thanking panel members, Michael and Martin as panel member, but particularly, of course, for his wonderful talk. And if you just bear with me a moment, I shall go and pick up a gift to give to Martin to thank him for his talk this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. And what we have here is a very special book by Harry Bankhead, Textile Manufacture, Taxation and Trade in Late and Post-Medieval Durham City. I hope you haven't already got a copy of it. It is literally a weighty tome. It's full of amazing detail. I have taken the opportunity to read it before handing it over. And Anne has very recently done a review of it, which is available now on the Trust's website. So if you'd like a sort of sneak preview, let's have a look at the Trust website and you'll get an excellent review of the book. It's signed by Gary, and he's in the process of producing the second volume of his diving exploits, focusing on pilgrim souvenirs. And the Trust is contributing to the publication cost of that. And that will appear with open later in the summer. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your attendance. I hope you've enjoyed that. Thanks for your contributions. Bye.